So today we're starting bones and skeletal tissues, and this lecture actually begins with a lot of things that we've been discussing in lab, which is the basic structure of bone, differentiating between compact and spongy bone, the basic unit of compact bone, which is the osteon. We're going to talk about those structures. So some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, you've already heard if you are in my lab, which you all should be. All right, we're going to start with cartilage. First, I want to show you this, which you should have seen this before. I'm going to try to see if I can get rid of this because it's in my way. It's not really cooperating. That's frustrating. All right. We'll just have to move on. I'll have to figure it out later. Go away. Okay. So when we covered tissues, we talked about cartilage as we were discussing tissues. What did you remember about cartilage? All right, 3 types. We talked about 3 types: fibrocartilage, hyaline cartilage, and elastic cartilage. And what else do you remember about cartilage? It does. All connective tissue starts out as mesenchyme. Very good. Anything else you can remember? Yep, epithelial tissue always connects. Very good, to connective tissue. But specifically about cartilage. Cartilage is a connective tissue. Anything else that you remember specifically about cartilage? You told me the 3 types. No, okay, it's avascular, so it doesn't have a good blood supply. So when you injure cartilage, it's a slow process of recovery, right? So not exactly what you want to do tearing cartilage. I'd almost, just knowing what I know about AMP, I'd almost rather break a bone than I had tear cartilage, because bone has a really rich, good blood supply, and cartilage does not, so it depends on diffusion of those nutrients. Now, if you look at this picture, it's the same picture that's in your textbook, and it color codes the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton, and it also color codes the cartilage. And if you look at your textbook, the textbook actually shows the colors better than the actual PowerPoint that you're seeing through the projector. But looking at your textbook, you can see those colors. What things you want to notice is denoting the axial skeleton versus the appendicular skeleton. It's the darker orange. And so you notice that the pelvic girdle is not a part of the axial skeleton, right? You do notice, of course, that the vertebral column is part of it, right? And your rib cage is part of it. Your sternum is part of it. But up here, the pectoral girdle is not part of it. Do you see that? So that's going to include your clavicle here that actually connects to the sternal end of the clavicle, and the scapula. It all connects to the axial skeleton, but it's not considered part of the appendicular skeleton, the axial skeleton. It's part of the appendicular skeleton. So the pelvic girdle and the pectoral girdle are appendicular structures. And you can see those denoted by a lighter color. And then also you can see the cartilages that are denoted. And hyaline cartilage is the most abundant cartilage in your body. And it has the blue color in your textbook. And most of your skeleton begins as hyaline cartilage. So that's the reason why babies are so flexible. All of their hyaline cartilage is not ossified. So that hyaline cartilage goes through a process of ossification to make the actual bone. Additionally, we have 2 other types of cartilage that are not nearly as common in the human body, but we have the fibrocartilage. 3 places we find fibrocartilage. Anybody want to name one for me? Okay, this is what makes up your intervertebral discs, right? So in between each vertebra is a padding of fibrocartilage. Now, oftentimes students will confuse or get confused about the cartilage in between the vertebra because there is also hyaline cartilage that covers the actual bone, right? Because where two bones meet, most always you're going to have hyaline cartilage on the ends of the bones. So what you're going to see is, and you'll see this in your picture, you'll see little bitty slices of blue because blue is standing for what in the text? Hyaline. So you'll see the little bitty, it looks kind of like a sandwich, and the middle part of the sandwich is really thick because it's showing you that fibrocartilage. And the fibrocartilage is a red color in your textbook. So you can see the thick padding of red in between the vertebra and then a really thin slice of blue showing you where the hyaline cartilage actually covers the bone. The other place you'll find fibrocartilage is at the pubic symphysis. So the pubic symphysis is the little padding of cartilage that connects the pelvic girdle, which I'll show you with my trusty pen here. So we're looking here. Everybody see that? That's your pubic symphysis. And anybody remember anything interesting about that pad of cartilage? Tears during childbirth, right? And one of my colleagues that used to work here with me, who's now retired, told me that if you did an autopsy, you could actually tell how many children an individual had up until 3 children. After 3 children, the scar tissue kind of starts running together, so you can't really see the tears as well. But that will actually tear apart. And towards the end of pregnancy, the hormone relaxin is releasing, and it softens that cartilage so that it will allow for expansion of the pelvic cavity for childbirth. And then the last place that is important where you have fibrocartilage is right here in this joint at the knee, right? So there's a pad there of fibrocartilage because that is a high compression area, lots of pressures hitting the knee. So extra cartilage, so there's a disc of fibrocartilage there. And then the other cartilage of interest is elastic cartilage. It's more stretchy, right? Do y'all remember seeing what it looks like? What does it look like? Interesting. I can see that. I can see that. But it does look like you could stretch it apart. So it's stretchy looking. And the way that you know you're looking at cartilage is you look for lacuna, right? So you look for the lacuna, which are like little rooms that house what? What is inside of the lacuna? Chondrocytes. Very good. So chondra makes you think cartilage because that's the cell of the cartilage, chondrocyte. You find elastic cartilage in your ear. So your ear is kind of stretchy. That's a stretchy cartilage. And you also find it in the epiglottis. So we have some cartilage in our respiratory passageways. You see lots of hyaline cartilage here. You see the cartilage that surrounds your thyroid area region and the cricoid cartilage. That's all hyaline cartilage, but there's a little bitty structure that protects the airways, and it's called the epiglottis, and it's actually that elastic cartilage. And when you swallow, as in if you were swallowing food, the epiglottis flap pulls right on over the airway so that the food doesn't enter the airway. So that passageway is protected because what happens if food gets in the airway? So you'll choke, right? Somebody will have to do the Heimlich maneuver on you. All right. Now, moving on, there are other ways to classify bone. So we've classified it by location. Often, and you'll see this, oftentimes in anatomy and physiology, we classify different organs, different body parts in different ways. Have y'all noticed that? One of the common ways is going to be by location. For example, when we were talking about membranes, do you remember when we were talking about membranes, we talked about parietal membranes and pericardial membranes? Do y'all remember that? Parietal told us something about that membrane location, right? It was lining the cavity. Visceral, remember what does that mean? It told us it was directly adhered to the organ. And then when we talked about pericardial, what did that give us an indication of? Heart. That told us location, right? So that's one of the ways to classify anything we're talking about in anatomy and physiology is location. Another way is structural makeup. Like, what does it look like or what's it made of? So that happens often. Well, looking at the bone, we can actually classify them by their shapes. So classifying them by their shapes, we have long bones, which is pretty easy to figure out because they're longer than they are wide. Short bones, which are usually cube-shaped. We have a lot of these in our wrist and ankle. You're going to see those cube-shaped short bones. And sesamoid bones. So a lot of times there'll be a little bone within the tendons or your patella, which is your kneecap, right? That's going to be a short bone. Flat bones, these are thin bones. A lot of times there's a little curvature to them. But one of the big things about a flat bone is there's always spongy bone inside of the flat bone, which I'm going to talk to you about momentarily. And then we have this other category that's kind of strange because we can't classify these bones in any other way, so we call them irregular. Can anybody think of an irregular bone? Your vertebra. That's like the most common answer there because it is such an odd shape. So we have many different ways of classifying the bones. So this is by looking at them. So we're basically looking at their shapes. Now, what are your bones for? And of course, every time we move on to a chapter, we're talking about a different body system or different organs. We talk about what their purpose is. And so now that we're at bones, let's talk about why you have bones. First of all, we have them for support. Obviously, they support the body and the soft organs. Protection, right? So your brain is protected by the skull. So it's very much so protective. Your spinal cord is protected inside of the vertebra. Remember the vertebral foramen that houses the spinal cord. Your vital organs are protected. Your rib cage protects, right? So that protects your lungs and your heart. We also have bones for movement. Bones are the point of attachment of all your muscles. And that's the reason why, and as a lever, it allows the muscle to do whatever action it is that you want it to do. So that's also very important. Another one that you don't think of probably as much is storage. Did you realize your bones store very important minerals for you? Mainly calcium. Now, phosphorus is important, certain growth factors, because your bones need to be strong. They don't need to be brittle where you can have an easy break, right? So there is strength in having calcium and phosphorus in our bones. But as a storage reservoir, where does calcium need to be first and foremost? What's probably the most important priority of calcium? Where should it be in our bodies? In your blood, right? Because if you'll recall, your basic functions can't take place without calcium in the blood. And that's things like calcium has to be available in the blood because that's where the cells draw it from for muscle contraction. Remember, calcium, you're about to learn when we start covering muscles that calcium floods the muscle and it can't contract without calcium. No contraction would occur if calcium was not available. So muscle contraction, nerve impulses can occur. You'll see when we get to the end of this course, when we're talking about the nervous system, calcium plays a role in allowing for neurotransmitters to release. So calcium is super important to the blood. So it helps to have an extra supply of it in the bones in case the blood supplies drop too low. And if the blood supplies drop too low, certain hormones are going to react, and it's going to cause the bone to release the calcium supplies into the blood so you'll have a sufficient amount. So it would be better to have brittle, broken bones than it would be to be dead, right? So that's the reason why you've got to have sufficient calcium in the blood. So the bones have a storage reservoir, and the calcium and phosphorus is there. Additionally, did you know that your blood was made in your bones? It is totally made in your bones in red bone marrow. Your red bone marrow is the site of hematopoiesis. And you have very special hematopoietic stem cells located here that actively divide to make your blood. Remember, a red blood cell can only live for about 120 days. Y'all remember talking about that cell doesn't have a nucleus, so it has a shorter life. So your body is constantly making new red blood cells. And then, in the middle of long bones, do y'all remember where I told you red bone marrow is located? Do y'all remember? In flat bones. Remember, in the flat bones. Where did I tell you is the most common place to extract red bone marrow? It would be in the hip. Anybody ever heard of anybody having a bone marrow transplant? Yeah? So they did. So if you have a bone marrow transplant, they're going to extract it usually from your hip region. Anybody know why? It's the least dangerous. It's the least dangerous place in the human body to extract from, because you think of the other flat bones. Where else do you have flat bones? Sternum, skull, right? No, no. Yes. Say that again. No, no, plasma is different. But if you donate plasma, they're extracting parts, certain part of the blood, and so sometimes individuals need that. Sometimes that'll be a blood expander to add. But when we're talking about bone marrow, typically you go in for a bone marrow transplant and you're a donor. I mean, that's pretty serious. It's a pretty serious procedure. It's not something that you do all the time, like giving blood. Pretty painful procedure because they're going to have to penetrate the bone, right? I don't think so. I think they do, but I don't think they put you to sleep. But they actually, they're going to have to puncture into the center of that bone, into the spongy bone. Remember another word for spongy bone? Diploid. Okay? So that's where the red bone marrow is found. So they've got to puncture into that bone very carefully, because it's a flat bone, right? You could go all the way through, which is why I don't want them drawing it from my sternum, because what's located behind my sternum? Your heart. So they could puncture the heart, or if they tried to go through my skull, they could puncture the brain, right? So they typically will get red bone marrow from the hip region. They can get it from other regions. I don't know. Probably just pain. I have heard of that, an interoscular IV. To get into those haversian canals. Yes. Remember, bone has a very rich blood supply, so you can penetrate the bone to get to that blood supply if needed. So bone having a rich blood supply, that's a good place to go if you can't get any superficial vessels. Okay, now the triglyceride storage that we're referring to here, that's in the yellow bone marrow. Does anybody know where you find the yellow bone marrow? In the long bones. In the center of long bones, there's a hollow cavity, and that's where you'll find the yellow bone marrow. So all of these are functions of bone. Now, talking about bone markings, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the bone markings because we talked about this in lab. You need to know this for lecture and lab because it's definitely in your best interest to learn the markings, because when you have a question about markings, you automatically know what's going on with it. Yes? Say that again? It is. You're exactly right. And that's actually mentioned at the end of the lecture. We're going to talk about hormones. But yes, he's exactly right. Hormones are super important. They're actually, I'm trying to think, hormones actually are involved in that they are going to cause the bones to release or uptake calcium. Okay? So we will talk about how hormones are related to bones, and it's super important. When we talk about hormones relative to the bones, it needs to stick with you, because you will have, I promise, you're going to have final exam questions about how hormones affect the bone. And the next semester, when you take me again, we're going to cover a whole chapter with hormones, and in that chapter, we'll cover the same material again. So it needs to stick. You need to think about it. Now, looking at bone markings, you should have already, hopefully, looked in your lab manual as we talked about it last week, looked in there to see what about the bone markings and what their purposes are. If there is any type of surface change in a bone, it's for what? It could be for attachment. It could be a passageway. It's for something. It has a purpose. So anytime there's a depression or a change in the surface of the bone, there is a purpose. It could be muscle attachment. It could be a blood vessel or nerve needs to go through. There are many different reasons why a bone changes in terrain, right? And that's what I've been teaching you about. So in lab, we've been learning all those markings. And you're looking at me going like, why do I need to learn all this? You were wanting me to say, hey, you need to know this one and not this one, right? But you may see one of my children in the emergency room, so I want you to know your stuff. And so that's the reason why learning the markings helps you learn all of those markings that you have to learn. Do you know why? Because often the markings are named according to what's going on. So you remember a while ago on the mandible I showed you a ramus, right? So that's a marking. A tuberosity, these are common little rounded projections. Now sometimes a rounded projection can mean a couple of different things, so you got to pay attention. Sometimes it's a more obvious rounded projection, right? Sometimes we call it a head. Okay, so you'll notice that. The femur and the humerus both have heads. A crest is a narrow, prominent ridge, and there's usually like a muscle going to attach along that ridge or something to that effect. That's the reason why you'll have a ridge. Trochanter, they're typically blunt and somewhat irregular. A line is also a narrow ridge of bone, not quite as prominent as a crest. Tubercle, is smaller than a tuberosity, rounded projection. You also have a condyle and an epicondyle. This is usually, when you find a condyle, it's a place where bones meet. Okay? I'll give you an example on the skull. Do y'all remember seeing a condyle? Okay, there was a mandibular condyle. Y'all remember what was happening there? So those bones were meeting and they move, right? Also, there's the occipital condyles where your vertebrae meet up with the skull. So a lot of times when bones they'll have facets upon a condyle, which is where they are going to articulate with one another. Sometimes you'll see a spine. Of course, the one we think of is the vertebra, right? The spinous process. And then you have a process. So any bony prominence could be a process. So a lot of times when they name that particular marking, it's named based upon these definitions. And so that'll help you hopefully remember that when you see it, what you're looking at. Also, think about when you're learning these, think about what their purpose is or what are they serving. For example, attachment, which is what Chris said a while ago. Is there a muscle attaching here, or possibly a ligament or a tendon? So there might be an attachment point. Also a surface, joint surface, which is where bones meet, right, and articulate. Or it could be a hole or a conduit serving blood vessels and nerves. So those are all things to think about when learning those markings. And this is projections that we talk about where there's a joint, so we actually denote those, and that's what I was talking about with the condyle. And I told you about the head being a bony expansion. Typically a head attaches to a neck. So on that bone you'll label, okay, here's the neck, here is the actual head, and the femur and the humerus are the best examples of that. And that's a joint, right? That's a joint with lots of movement, so it has a wide array of movement. Then a facet, usually flat. And the facets are usually flat, and that's at a point where bones typically meet, and so is a condyle, but a condyle is not as flat as a facet. It's more rounded. So you'll be able to see that in some of the bones when you come to a condyle. And a lot of times if you have a condyle, you're going to have a epicondyle, right? Because epi means upon. So that'll be the structure upon the condyle. And then the ramus, which I showed you one of these a while ago on the skull. It's an arm-like bar. Do y'all remember seeing the ramus? So there was that arm-like bar that you saw. Additionally, we have sinuses. A sinus cavity, We'll talk about sinus cavities in our skull. As a matter of fact, we already talked about sinus cavities in our skull. Anybody know what the purpose of a sinus is? It actually lightens the load of your skull. Think about when you were stopped up and see their mucus-lined cells. When they fill up with mucus, you feel like you have a heavy head, right? Imagine if that was solid bone. You'd really have a heavy head, right? So they do lighten the load of the skull, and additionally, they contribute to the resonance of your voice, which is why your voice changes when you get all stopped up, because those chambers are stopped up and the resonance is not the same. So they do have their purpose. Meatus is a canal-like passageway, so if you have a meatus, you might have a passageway for a blood vessel or nerves. Also, a foramen is a little opening as well. Sometimes you'll have, it's a passageway for blood and nerves. A fossa is a little depression in the bone. So sometimes you'll have a fossa, so that's what the terminology to describe that little depression. A groove, okay, which is a furrow in the bone, or a fissure. So, and if you have a fissure, when we've seen these fissures, I think I have noted the fissure in the fissures in the orbital cavities. Y'all remember seeing that last week? So it's a little slit, okay? All of those are terminology that I want you to be familiar with and just basically understand and know. And this is the most basic of learning, guys. This is definitional, right? Yeah. You're talking about the bat bone, the sphenoid? There is a bone in your skull that looks like a bat. It's called the sphenoid bone. We'll look at that in a moment. Yes, it is, because the sphenoid bone is what you're seeing in those orbital cavities. So you probably remember seeing that in the actual lab manual. All right, now let me give you another way to classify bones, and that is its makeup, right? So what is it in this particular situation? It's a texture situation, and that is we can actually categorize bone as either compact or spongy. And another term for spongy bone is cancellous. Cancellous bone is a very acceptable terminology. And those little structures, we can also call it diploid, okay? And basically what you see, it's a honeycomb-looking structure. I'll show you a picture momentarily. And the little spicules coming out, they're called trabeculae. Compact bone has its own very evident or obvious structure, and we're going to look at that as well. But it's much more dense, and it's for, this particular bone is for strength, okay? Spongy bone you could crush, right? So spongy bone has a different purpose, and that's housing red bone marrow, while your compact bone is there to be strong for protection. Now, let's look at the structure of a long bone. This is just showing you the basic structure of a long bone. And a long bone contains both compact bone and spongy bone. Additionally, on all long bones, you're going to have a diaphysis, which is the shaft of the bone, and that's where you'll have that medullary cavity in the center, which also has an epiphysis on each end. So the diaphysis with epiphyses on each end. And in the epiphyses, we have what we call an epiphyseal line. The epiphyseal line, if you're an adult, is basically the remnants of your growth plate. Okay? So when you finish growing, your growth plate closes off, and it just becomes the epiphyseal line. In the epiphyses, you also find, of course, this is where spongy bone is found, and you'll also find hyaline cartilage that covers the ends of long bones on the epiphysis. Remember how we saw that blue on the picture at the very beginning of the lecture? Y'all remember that? That was showing you the hyaline cartilage that covers the ends of the long bones. And everywhere a bone articulates with another bone, you want hyaline cartilage there. Why would you want hyaline cartilage? Well, because it reduces friction. What would happen if that bone grinded against itself? It'd be bad. Well, that'd be painful, right? So that is a surface to reduce that friction. So we can call that hyaline cartilage, or we can call it articular cartilage. You see how we name that two different ways? If we named it hyaline cartilage, it would tell us about what it's made of, pretty much, right? But if we called it articular cartilage, what does that tell us? It's located at a site of articulation, so where bones meet. So do you see how we can, when we name things, there's a reason for it? So it can either be giving you an indication of a location, or it can be giving you an indication of what it's made of. So we have many different ways to name things. So this is basically the picture that you've already seen in your lab manual, right? Everybody seen that before? What happened? Okay. No. All bones don't have spongy bone. Flat bones have spongy bone inside of them, and long bones have spongy bone on the ends. But not all bones are necessarily spongy. If you look at the long bone, anybody know what bone we're looking at? Humerus. All right, so we're looking at the humerus, and it's a really good example of looking at a long bone. So, and remember to classify a long bone, it's much longer than it is wide. And we can see here's our diaphysis, and on the ends are the epiphysis here. And what's this blue pad of tissue here? All right, hyaline cartilage, that's an articular surface, right? So there's articular cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage. All right, here we can see the epiphyseal line. Y'all see that? That is where the growth plate once was if you're an adult. And that's where growth occurs if you're still an adolescent. Those cells divide and proliferate, and the bone is able to actually grow. And we're going to decipher between types of growth in a moment, because you have endochondral ossification, you have appositional growth. So it's depending on the purpose of what's actually going on. Then you also see in the epiphyses, here's the spongy bone. Okay? So there's spongy bone in the ends here, and that would be where you would find red bone marrow, right? But then here, this is called the medullary cavity. What's inside the medullary cavity? Yellow bone marrow, which is a fatty adipose type tissue, because that's where energy storage would be, is in the center of that long bone. Now internally, the cavity is lined by a tissue called endosteum. Okay, so endo, if you think of the word endo, you think endosteum. So you can see that. And on the outside of the bone, there's a tissue called periosteum. So the periosteum covers the bone. And the periosteum is attached to the bone by special fibers called Sharpie's fibers, aka perforating fibers. Have y'all seen that in the text? So these specialized fibers hold the periosteum onto the bone. Now inside of the periosteum are very special cells. These cells are called osteoblast, osteoclast, and osteogenic cells. Osteogenic cells are the stem cells that will become either osteoclast or osteoblast. And there's a big difference between these two types of cells, and it's very important that you be able to distinguish between an osteoclast and an osteoblast. And the difference is osteoblast build bone up. Okay, so these are the cells that are basically laying out bone for your skeleton. So what do you think an osteoclast does? It's breaking it down. So the osteoclasts break the bone down, and in doing so, what is it going to be releasing into the blood? Calcium. So the osteoclasts are going to release calcium into your blood, but at the same time, it's going to be breaking the bone down. Osteoblast would be taking the calcium out of the blood and depositing it into your bone and building it up. And I had a student a long time ago who told me the way he remembered the difference between an osteoblast and an osteoclast, he remembered blast builds up, excuse me, and clash it down. So if you can't remember which one does what, maybe that little mnemonic will help you remember. So blast builds up, clash it down. So maybe that'll help you to remember. Also, of course, we have nerve fibers running through the periosteum and into the bone, blood vessels, lymphatics, also all located in there, good nutrition supply. And here's those little fibers, Sharpie's fibers. Also in your book they call it perforating fibers, holds the periosteum onto the bone. and the endosteum being the membrane that lines the internal medullary cavity. Also, the endosteum has osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So the bone is remodeled or resorbed externally and internally. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you right here. Yes, Robert. So if you look at this picture, she just asked me, how does blood get into the bones? It's because it's made up because of compact bone can release, these blood vessels actually release into the spongy bone, which is a bunch of little cavities. So blood can go in there pretty easily. But how does blood get into this compact bone? And that's because of the osteon. Do you remember looking at the actual tissues? And how did you denote that you were looking at bone? Tree trunks. Everybody remembers tree trunks. Well, that tree trunk, the very center, carries the blood. But let me tell you what you need to no longer think in terms of tree trunks, but you now need to call that tree trunk an osteon. So that entire structure is an osteon, and at the center of every osteon is a canal. Remember, that was one of our bone markings we just talked about. It was called a Haversian canal. And what do you think runs through that canal? Blood vessels and nerves. So here in this picture here, here's where the canals are. Y'all see that? I'm coloring them in blue. To denote the osteon, which is, the osteon is what we call the unit of compact bone. So several osteons make up compact bone. So this little tree trunk is an osteon. Y'all see that? Here's an osteon. Here's one. Here's one. Here's one. Y'all see them? All of those are osteons. And in the center of every osteon is going to be a Haversian canal. Now, all of these, y'all see all these Haversian canals are going one direction. Y'all see that? Well, what do you think connects them? It's another type of canal, and it's called Volkmann's canals. And those canals are basically running perpendicular to the Haversian canals and make a connection point in between them. Now, from this picture also, you can see very well those fibers I was telling you about that connect the periosteum to the bone, known as perforating or Sharpie's fibers. And you can see how the arteries run through the actual periosteum to get inside the bone to the structure of the osteon. So, basically, bones are covered, compact bone is covered in with the periosteum, and the endosteum typically covers spongy bone within. But it is the internal membrane of the bone. And also to remember spongy bone, what's another word for that? It's the diploid in your flat bones. So in flat bones we call it diploid. That would be where we would extract red bone marrow. And so that red bone marrow are between the trabeculae. So just to show you that, these are the trabeculae. Y'all see that? Basically these little sticks. Y'all see that? Well, and there's spaces. So here's the space in between. What do you think are in these spaces? That would, well, blood, but it's going to be red bone marrow. Y'all see that? And so here's a section of skull here. Y'all see all the spongy bone inside the skull? So all these little spicules are trabeculae, and inside those little holes is going to be the red bone marrow. Additionally, all the spongy bone on the exterior has a layer of compact bone, which is super important, right? Because that's the tough bone. It's strong, so it's protective. So in order to get to the hematopoietic tissue inside of the spongy bone, you're going to have to penetrate some of that tough compact bone, which is why I was telling you guys earlier, you have to basically, you've got to get through that little layer of compact bone to get to the spongy bone when you go to do an extraction of that tissue. So that's, if you hit it too far, you could go all the way through the compact bone on the other side and puncture the organ. So that's why we have to be very careful about where we get that tissue. But where do we find hematopoietic tissue? Well, red bone marrow cavities, okay? And in adults, as a child, you have more red bone marrow cavities because you remember those yellow bone marrow cavities? they begin as red bone marrow. So as a child, you have more sources of red bone marrow, and as we become adults, those cavities that are the medullary cavities, that turns into the yellow bone marrow, which is just a fatty tissue. But if you're an adult, the place to be able to find red bone marrow is going to be either flat bones or the ends of long bones. Do you guys remember me showing you the picture of the long bone? And you saw all that spongy bone? That spongy bone always contains red bone marrow. Now, back to the cells of bone. So I already told you about osteoclasts and osteoblasts, right? And osteogenic cells. Osteogenic cells are the stem cells of bone. They're the cells that divide in your periosteum and endosteum to make osteoblasts, because osteoblasts are going to build your bone. So those cells are super important, right? So osteoblasts build your bone, and osteoclast break it down. And osteocyte is one of those cells that you see that are trapped in bone. They're the mature bone cells. Remember the lacuna? We're going to see lacuna here in a second. We look at the osteon. They have osteocytes located in them. They're trapped. They're mature cells. They're not going to be dividing anymore. They're trapped inside the bone, so they can't actually build up or break down. Additionally, looking at the osteon, we talked about the Haversian system, or the osteon. Haversian system is another name for an osteon, and that's your structural unit of compact bone. And this is a super important thing to kind of understand and know. So let's actually look at the picture. No. Osteon, and actually I think most of everything is going to refer more so to it as osteon. So make sure you know both. But the Haversian system is another terminology for it. Now what you see here are the lamellae. And the lamellae are denoted because you know how you saw the tree trunks? It looks like it's in layers. Each layer is lamellae, and it has collagen fibers in it. And you notice the collagen fibers are all going in different directions. Do y'all see that? That's because the bones have different stresses coming from different directions. So the collagen fibers are running in different ways, but it's kind of layered. So it's layer upon layer upon layer, and that's inside of an osteon. And what's in the very center of that? All right, you can see that, but what would we call that canal? What canal is in? The Haversian canal is in the very center of the osteon. So you can see, because of the collagen fibers going in different directions, the bone can take on like a twisting force. That's the reason for having those lamellae. So lamellae are each concentric circle, and that circle is going to have collagen fibers in a certain direction, and then the next circle, which is lamellae, goes in a different direction. Additionally, we have Volkmann's canals, or perforating canals, that connect the Haversian canals. So these are the canals that hit the Haversian canals at right angles. So they're perpendicular to the Haversian canals so that all the blood supplies can meet up together, right? So there's something connecting the blood supply. So all of those Haversian canals, if you're looking at a sliver of compact bone, they all have Volkmann canals connecting them underneath. Lacuna. Have we seen lacuna before? All right, we have. We saw that in cartilage. And these are little bitty cavities that have osteocytes in them. And then the last thing to note is the canaliculi. Canaliculi are the little canals that connect the lacuna to each other, because if there's a cell inside of that lacuna, it needs a blood supply, right? So canaliculi allows the blood supply to radiate out from the Haversian canal. And so you can see that in this picture here. This is all of it in a nutshell that I've been showing you, and I realize it's time to go. But you can see here's your Haversian canal, here's the lamellae, here's the lacuna, here's the cells inside of it. The little lines coming out are the canaliculi, so that the blood supply can radiate out to the osteocytes. Yes? Those are Sharpie's fibers holding the periosteum on. See that? Your textbook is a much better picture. If you look in your textbook, you can see it a lot better. So we're going to stop right here. I'm going to load this PowerPoint up for you as well as the next two right this minute so you'll have it. Y'all have a great day. I'll see you on Thursday in lab, 10 a.m.